Hey everyone, welcome back. You ready to unpack some heavy stuff this week?
Oh, yeah.
We're diving into two tragic plane crashes,
Mm.
one in Philadelphia, the other D.C., and we're using live news updates from Fox News Digital as they were happening,
Wow.
as they were unfolding.
So interesting, right?
It's not just about what happened, though. We're going to
Right.
try to understand the ripple effects, the investigations, the whole shebang.
It's fascinating how these live updates give you like a front row seat to a story as it's unfolding.
Right.
You see the initial scramble for information,
Yeah.
the confusion, and then gradually
Yeah.
a clearer picture emerges.
Yeah,
Though never quite complete, of course.
exactly. And with investigations just starting, there are bound to be more twists and turns.
Oh, for sure.
Let's start with the D.C. crash, which happened Wednesday evening.
Okay.
American Airlines Flight 5342 collided with an Army Black Hawk helicopter near Reagan National Airport.
Oh, wow.
Tragically, it's presumed that all 67 people on board 64 on the plane and 3 soldiers on the helicopter are gone.
And the location of the crash over the Potomac River so close to the airport
Yeah.
really added to the complexity.
Yeah?
Imagine the challenges for rescue and recovery efforts with those currents in the frigid water.
Absolutely. Early updates from Fox News were all about those frantic rescue attempts.
Yeah.
But as time went on, the focus shifted to the heartbreaking task of recovering victims and, of course, figuring out how this could have happened.
Right, and that's where things get really interesting. This wasn't just any training flight you see.
Okay.
The soldiers on the Black Hawk were practicing for what they call continuity of government operations.
Mhm.
Essentially, emergency evacuations of VIPs. High-ranking government officials think like designated survivor type stuff.
Wow, so these were highly trained individuals. And still this happened. Makes you think about the inherent risks involved in those kinds of operations, especially so close to a major airport. Now, I know we'll get into the investigation more later, but was there anything in the news that stood out to you about the possible causes?
There are a couple things. First, initial reports suggest the helicopter may have been flying higher than it should have,
Okay.
possibly putting it on a collision course with the American Airlines jet.
Right.
There's also talk about the helicopter deviating from its approved flight path, a low-altitude route specifically designed to avoid commercial air traffic.
Okay.
And then you have the reports of air traffic control staffing shortages, even a claim that one controller was working 2 positions at once.
Oh, my goodness.
So a lot of potential factors at play here.
It's mind-boggling, really, the number of things that have to go right for a flight to be safe.
Right.
One little slip-up, one missed communication and tragedy strikes,
Mhm.
speaking of potential slip-ups. There was some speculation about the Black Hawk crew using night vision goggles, right? Could that have played a role?
Yes, and that's where it gets really fascinating because we have to think about how technology intersects with human perception.
Right.
The crew is qualified to use night vision goggles, but there's been chatter that the ambient light around Reagan National combined with the goggles could have caused depth perception issues. It's certainly something investigators will look into, but it highlights how even with advanced technology, the human element is still a crucial factor.
It's true. And of course, there's always the possibility of mechanical failure.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of which, the news update mentioned that the NTSD, that's the National Transportation Safety Board, for those who aren't familiar, they recovered the black boxes, which is actually a misnomer since they're bright orange.
They are indeed, but they're
Yeah.
absolutely vital to these investigations. The data recorders capture everything: altitude, airspeed, heading, engine performance, and the cockpit voice recorders give investigators a window into the conversations, the actions of the pilots in those final moments.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly complex investigation, a lot of potential factors to consider. But what about the human side of this story? I mean, you can't read these updates without being struck by the sheer loss of life, and not just numbers, but real people.
Absolutely. The news mentioned a group of young elite figure skaters on the plane.
Right.
Everly and Lydia Livingston, along with their parents and coaches. Just heartbreaking to think about their dreams cut short.
It is, and there were so many others. Casey Crafton, the youth soccer coach from Connecticut, who, by all accounts, had a profound impact on the kids he coached. Dr. Kia Duggins, the Howard University professor,
Yeah.
a brilliant legal mind who had just taken on a new role in her career. Each one of these 64 passengers, a world unto themselves, gone in an instant.
And then the 3 soldiers on the Black Hawk, their names largely kept out of the news at the request of their families. We do know they were part of a unit responsible for the security of some of the most powerful people in the country. Their mission, their training, their very presence on that helicopter speaks volumes about the high-stakes world they operated in.
It's a reminder that sometimes, even in the midst of tragedy, there are layers of secrecy and security that make it even harder to grasp the full scope of what happened. You mentioned the families requesting privacy. The news also had this poignant account from a pastor in Wichita who was at the airport when families started arriving. He described it as just stunned silence and overwhelming grief, a scene that's hard to shake.
Imagine the weight of that grief multiplied 67 times over. It's almost unbearable to contemplate, and yet in these updates you see glimmers of strength, too.
Yeah,
That same pastor talked about how the community rallied around those families offering support and solace. It speaks to the human capacity for compassion in the face of unimaginable loss.
it does. And a gesture that I found, both somber and significant. American Airlines retired flight number 5342 in response to the crash. Not just a logistical move, but a symbolic act acknowledging the weight of this event, the lives lost, and the impact it will forever have on those left behind.
It's a powerful statement, isn't it? And it raises a question, what does an act like this actually do? Does it change public perception of the airline? Does it prompt any internal policy changes? Or is it simply a symbolic gesture? Perhaps it's a bit of all three.
I think you're onto something there. We often see these symbolic gestures after tragedies, but it's worth considering their deeper meaning and impact.
It is, and it's a question we can carry with us as we move on to discuss the second crash, the one in Philadelphia, which happened just a few days later because that crash, while thankfully involving fewer casualties, adds another layer of complexity to this whole conversation about aviation safety.
Hold on, let's save that for part two.
All right, I can't wait to dive into that. So you were about to say something about the Philadelphia crash, adding another layer to the aviation safety conversation.
Right, it's like just as the nation is reeling from the D.C. crash, this other one happens, a Learjet 55 going down near the Roosevelt Mall in Philadelphia on Friday evening. Thankfully, only 2 people on board this time.
But the timing so soon after the DC tragedy, it's almost like a 1-2 punch to the gut, right?
Yeah,
It makes you wonder if there's something bigger going on, a systemic issue that needs to be addressed.
exactly. And the circumstances of the Philadelphia crash are pretty dramatic. There's this eyewitness video and the Fox News updates capturing the plane going down the flames. It must have been terrifying for anyone nearby.
Absolutely. It's one thing to read about a crash in a news article, but to actually see the footage, to witness the immediacy of it, it really brings home the reality of these events, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And the fact that this one happened in a densely populated area near a mall, it raises questions about the potential for even greater casualties in a situation like this.
Right. You can't help but think about the what ifs. What if the plane had crashed just a few minutes later when the mall was more crowded? What if it had hit a residential area? It's a chilling thought.
It is so, with these 2 crashes happening so close together, all eyes are on the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. They're the ones responsible for ensuring the safety of our skies, and people are demanding answers.
And they're facing intense scrutiny from all sides. You have President Trump calling for an immediate assessment of their hiring standards and safety protocols. Then you have members of Congress demanding oversight of airport staffing and safety procedures. There's a real sense that something needs to change.
It feels like a pivotal moment, like we're at a crossroads. Do we continue with the status quo reacting to incidents after they happen, or do we take a more proactive approach, really investing in prevention?
It's a crucial question, and it's not just about throwing money at the problem either. It's about looking at the system as a whole, identifying potential weaknesses, and implementing solutions that address the root causes of these incidents.
Speaking of solutions, there was a lot of talk in the news updates about technology and its role in aviation safety, specifically these collision avoidance systems that are already used in commercial aircraft.
Right, these systems are pretty sophisticated. They use radar and GPS data to detect potential collisions and alert pilots, even providing guidance on how to avoid them. The problem is, they're not typically found in military aircraft like the Black Hawk involved in the DC crash.
And there was actually a former Black Hawk pilot, who's now a congressman, calling for those systems to be implemented in military aircraft as well. Makes sense, doesn't it? If it can prevent even one of these tragedies, it seems like a no-brainer.
It does seem logical, but there are some challenges. For one, these systems rely on both aircraft having transponders that can communicate with each other.
Oh.
So if a military aircraft without a transponder is flying near a commercial aircraft with the system, it might not be effective.
I see. So it's not as simple as just installing the technology. You need that communication network, that shared language between aircraft for it to work properly.
Exactly. And then there's the cost factor. Outfitting an entire fleet of military aircraft with these systems would be a massive undertaking, both financially and logistically.
Right, so it seems like there's no easy fix here. It's going to require a multifaceted approach technology training staffing, and probably a whole lot of bureaucracy. But hey, that's what the FAA is for, right?
Well, in theory, yes, but it's going to take a lot of pressure, a lot of public outcry to really push them to make the necessary changes, and that's where we, as informed citizens, have a role to play.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
We need to keep talking about this, keep asking questions, keep holding those in power accountable.
exactly, because ultimately it's about saving lives.
Okay, so we've talked about the crashes,
Yeah.
the investigations, the political fallout, the potential solutions, but I want to circle back to something you said earlier about the human element.
hmm
It's easy to get lost in the technical details, the big picture stuff, but these events ultimately come down to people.
You're right. It's so important to remember that behind the headlines, behind the statistics, there are real people whose lives have been irrevocably altered by these tragedies.
And I'm not just talking about those who were lost, though their absence is undoubtedly the most profound loss. I'm also thinking about the families, the friends, the communities who are now left to pick up the pieces.
The ripple effects of these crashes extend far beyond the immediate victims. There are first responders who witnessed horrific scenes, air traffic controllers who may be grappling with guilt, or trauma investigators who are tasked with piecing together the events that led to these losses.
And then there are the countless others who may not have known the victims personally, but who are nonetheless shaken by these events. People who are now afraid to fly, who are questioning the safety of our skies, who are grappling with their own mortality.
It's a collective trauma in a way, and it's important to acknowledge that, to allow ourselves to feel the weight of it, to grieve, to process, to support one another.
It's interesting that, how these news updates, as factual as they are, can also reveal so much about the human spirit. We see the shock, the confusion, the grief, but we also see the resilience, the compassion, the determination to find answers and prevent future tragedies.
Yes, it's that duality that makes these events so compelling, so heartbreaking, and ultimately so human.
And it's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, hope for healing, hope for change, hope for a future where these kinds of tragedies are less frequent.
Speaking of the future, I know we're going to wrap up this deep dive soon, but I can't help but wonder.
Ooh, cliffhanger. I guess we'll have to wait for part 3 to hear what's on your mind.
We got it. See you then.
All right, back for the final leg of our deep dive into these plane crashes you left us hanging last time, saying you were wondering about something.
Yeah, I was thinking about the future. We've dissected these crashes, explored the investigations, talked about potential solutions, but what does all this mean for, like, the average person, for you listening right now? Does it change how you view air travel?
That's a great question, and honestly, it's one I've been wrestling with myself. On the one hand, hearing about these crashes back to back, digging into all the details,
Yeah.
it's hard not to feel a little uneasy, like, what if it happens to me?
Right.
Yeah.
It's a natural reaction, but it's important to keep things in perspective. Statistically speaking, air travel is still one of the safest modes of transportation. You're more likely to be in a car accident on your way to the airport than to experience a plane crash.
That's true. And I guess knowing that there are ongoing efforts to enhance safety measures to learn from these tragedies, that does offer some reassurance.
It should. Think about it. Every time there's a major aviation incident, it triggers a wave of investigations, new regulations, technological advancements. It's a constant evolution driven by a desire to make flying as safe as humanly possible.
Right. It's like we can't undo what's happened, but we can use those events as catalysts for positive change.
Exactly. And as we become more informed, we can also become more empowered. We can ask tough questions of the airlines, of the FAA, of our elected officials. We can advocate for safer skies, not just for ourselves, but for everyone.
So it's not just about being like a passive passenger hoping for the best. It's about being an active participant in the conversation about aviation safety.
Precisely. And, while we've focused heavily on the technical and systemic aspects of these crashes, there's another layer to consider, one that goes beyond regulations and technology.
I think I know where you're going with this, the human element.
Exactly. These crashes, as devastating as they are, remind us of the fragility of life, the preciousness of our time with loved ones. They make us think about what truly matters.
Like a wake-up call, isn't it? Suddenly those little annoyances, those everyday stresses, they seem so insignificant in the face of such immense loss.
Absolutely. And it makes you appreciate the moments we often take for granted: a simple phone call with a friend, a hug from a family member, a beautiful sunset. Things we might normally rush through, we suddenly see with fresh eyes, with gratitude.
As we were going through those news updates, I was struck by the stories of the victims, the young figure skaters, the dedicated coach, the passionate professor. They weren't just names on a list. They were people with dreams, with families, with lives that were cut tragically short.
And that's the message I hope you take away from this deep dive. Yes, aviation safety is crucial, and we need to continue pushing for improvements, but we also need to live our lives with intention, with purpose, with a deep appreciation for every moment.
Because as we've learned, life is unpredictable. We can't control everything that happens to us, but we can choose how we respond, how we love, how we make our mark on the world.
Beautifully said. And let's not forget the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, we see communities coming together, offering support, sharing stories, finding ways to honor the memory of those lost. It's a testament to our capacity for compassion, for hope, for healing.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. What if, instead of letting these tragedies paralyze us with fear, we use them as fuel to live more intentionally, more courageously, and with a deeper appreciation for the gift of life?
What a powerful way to frame it, to honor those we've lost by embracing life with open hearts and unwavering spirits.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
And by working together to create a world where such tragedies become less and less frequent. Thanks for joining us for this difficult but important deep dive.
It's been an honor to share these reflections with you. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay connected to what truly matters.